I was able to listen in to a couple of presentations earlier in the day today. Of course, not all of them, but I'm really happy that Damien and was talking a little bit more about the power of context in relation to emotions and eliciting emotion and consumer response, because this is largely what I'm going to talk about, how emotions really are being felt and perceived in the context of brands, messaging, advertising, marketing. So I'm going to look at emotion much more from, let's say, an anthropological perspective, cultural perspective, and how brands create meaning. Okay, so a little bit more about me. I sort of have a very unusual background in quite like a lot of things that I do in business. So I started in academia and I have a doctorate in media studies. So I'm a part social scientist, but also commercially, I'm also a brand advisor, cultural strategist, and semiotician. And about 3 years ago, I founded my own consultancy called Meaning Global, which strictly deals with meaning. The reason I founded a consultancy was that during the last 15 or about 16 years that I was working in marketing and in loads of different positions, management consulting, strategy, planning, market research, all that in like different countries. What I was sort of getting at continuously was this lack of meaning in everything that I was doing, because I was observing that sort of value chain is very siloed and the value that we are creating is very fragmented. So what I wanted to do was to create consultancy that would sort of help brands and businesses to offset this inherent lack of meaning and really bring to their conscious awareness and conscious attention the role of culture and the real world context in how their messages and the brand campaigns are really being perceived by people in the real world versus how they're being planned in the planning department. Right. Actually, Seth mentioned a little bit this interview that we did together for the Customer Experience magazine today. I am just to do like a couple of highlights at the beginning of my talk so that you guys understand the real context of what I'm going to talk about, because I do understand that I'm a little bit of an outlier in the program, because I am not a researcher and I don't really look at emotions from, let's say, a biological perspective or even like a technological perspective. So what is meaning and why it matters? Meaning from the point of view of a semiotician or a brand anthropologist is the core of value exchange. People value meaning in brands. They don't value brands per se for themselves. They do consume the meaning that is inherent in the brand. Brands are in the business of meaning exchange. When meaning isn't present, you can immediately sense it, because the brand really won't resonate with people. It cannot deliver on its promise and fails to generate real value for the customers. Its sense of brand value implodes and the market sales tank. So what we really can say predominantly that, meaning really isn't a problem when a brand is meaningful. You can really pretty much see it when it's not there. And from a perspective of a semiotician, if you look at the job of a marketer and what marketers are doing, we can say that marketers really are commercial meaning makers. Their jobs really shouldn't be about counting or data measurement as much as understanding the role of emotions and human psychology and how we create value and how we perceive value and how we consume value. So brand management really is meaning management. And why is this important for brands and businesses to lead with meaning? The absence of it. So it really is important because it's a big problem, because we don't do it precisely. What we do in business and in brand management is almost the exact opposite of that. We try to squeeze out the maximum amount of profit for the minimum amount of resources. But that's really not the purpose of business, because what we should be doing is creating meaning and real value for people instead. So when you look at how businesses treat meaning, we sort of treat humanity as a fuel to businesses rather than using businesses as a fuel for humanity to flourish. So I think that in order for us to lead with meaning, what we really need to do is sort of to adjust the lens through which we look at the world, what we do in business, and our place in it. And with meaning and cultural relevance at the core, brands can become meaningful to people again. They can become vibrant and resonant in culture and profitable in business. So these are just like a couple of really like a digested points from the interview. If you're gonna get like a a whole read, just please go to the link that will give you. And now to the talk. So I just wanted to talk a little bit more about this context to help you understand what are really the levels of meaning fragmentation that we are dealing with, not just in business, but in society in general. So obviously the world has changed, we know that. But to what degree it has changed and on which levels, that's a whole other story. So there are three fundamental changes in the world that are really affecting how brands are being perceived and how businesses create value. So the first one is cultural and societal. What we can say is that there is almost a sense of the shifting foundations of our world as we know it. The foundations of meaning we see today, where everything is sort of being questioned and rethought, have a powerful effect on how brands create value in the real world. As the context changes, we no longer really positively know what things mean anymore, which makes it very difficult for brands as well to create relevance, to signal their value. And this affects how we perceive everything in the world, including brands and businesses. But of course, it's not just a problem for brands and business. It's really a problem for us as humanity, as people. And what actually cognitive scientists and sociologists are talking about in academia, specifically the University of Toronto professor in cognitive sciences, Dr. John Vervaeke, is it's almost like there is this great cultural disembedding process going on. Suddenly, we have been sort of thrust into this mass crisis of meaning, where we are dealing with something like a collapse of the old cultural and social narrative that we were able to rely on back in the past to sort of navigate our way through the world and understand what things mean. And it was also part of that social and cultural narrative was also the narrative of consumption, right? How we sort of how we value brands, what brands are supposed to do, what business they're in, and all of that is sort of being disembedded as the very foundations of the world that we live in are increasingly becoming destabilized and disintegrated. So, and how are they becoming disintegrated or destabilized, and why? What are all of these like cultural erosive factors? Well, obviously, global cultural complexity. And by the way, this was all happening even before COVID. So enter COVID and you get like even more disruption. Great cultural complexity, because we are suddenly, connected by digital technology, but increasingly disconnected from ourselves. There's an accelerated sort of speed and scale of change, greater volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambivalence of things. As I was saying, we no longer positively know what things mean anymore. We are dealing with something like an erosion of, trust and truth, the new concept of post-truth, fake news. Suddenly, there is a much greater importance to be diverse and inclusive and understanding properly what that means. There's a much greater emphasis put on the idea of identity, and therefore businesses need to be much more sensitive to cultural nuances, to craft cultural relevance, and hyper-personalization, individualization, fast-changing human needs, the idea of taking back control, because obviously things are changing so much, they're increasingly out of our control. And with this COVID pandemic, increasingly the importance to take proper care of ourselves, venture inward, connect back to our essence, to our soul, take good care of our health and well-being. So all of this is completely changing the idea of the world, what it looks like, and what our place in it is. And obviously that is impacting brands and businesses as well. In the marketplace, oversaturation, too much product, very little point of differentiation. And the sheer volume of everything that we're dealing with is really creating the erosion of meaning, because in this such a vast amount of all the possible brands and packaging and products that you can possibly think of, things don't really mean much anymore, because there's simply just too much of it. Homogenization, globalization led to sort of homogenized lifestyle and values, beliefs, and authentic cultural differences throughout the world, which, if you think about it, again, if cultural relevance is one of the core assets of how brands can differentiate themselves and encapsulate value from the inside out, if you flatten out sort of and even out all these cultural differences and markets around the world, then how is the brand supposed to really create those emotional bonds with people in different cultures if it's all flattened and homogenized? Fragmentation, too much data and too little meaning. We live in an era of overemphasis on technology and data, which leads to fragmentation of sense. The ubiquitous noise, right? Clutter, noise clogs our minds and poisons our ability to think clearly and even have like a longer attention span to make proper judgments and decisions. And the final thing, cultural irrelevance. As there is so much cultural complexity around the world, because we are so increasingly connected to different markets, different countries, culture is actually becoming the new sort of number one intangible product of brands, which pushes clients to act in very sort of uncertain and unknown ways, which then by default creates this sort of backlash of cultural irrelevance, as traditionally led organizations are sort of increasingly out of touch with our social reality and the means how to portray it. And we could see it in a bunch of different places in the recent years, in the last, let's say, 3 or 4 years. The Gillette example is something that we'll be talking about in a minute. The Dove Body Diverse bottles, the sort of literal translation of female body diversity into product packaging, completely tone deaf and terribly wrong. Or the accidental racism, and obviously the sort of vague portrayal of global message of unity and peace and diversity in the now infamous Pepsi Kendall Jenner campaign. So what is all of this doing together is that cultural irrelevance really causes the fragmentation of perceived brand value. And it's one of the core reasons why brands struggle to grow today and lose a significant amount of value when it comes to their brand equity, market value, and market share. So that was a second factor. Now the third, and that's probably the one that is the least apparent and is going to be very tough to sort of offset that, because it deals with the very foundation that many organizations, as we know them today, were sort of built on historically. So historically, there was this idea that organizations are sort of more of machines rather than, let's say, self-evolving sort of organisms that should be sort of surrounded around by around the core value that they offer to people, rather than sort of use this mechanistic and sort of linear thinking to flatten out the value they create and sort of put people into boxes. And this is really important because metaphors obviously create meaning. So the way that we think about things and the way that we structure our thoughts obviously matters, because this is what the things will become. So if we think about organizations as in the old world logic as sort of machines, this is what we get, right? We get an organization that is very much focused on generating profit, the maximum amount of efficiency, endless growth, waste, cost cutting, optimization, short-term thinking, focus on measurement and KPIs and quarterly results, almost like an obsession with data measurement, performance oriented. And it's not very much about people, it's not very much about value, and it's not very much about meaning, which is actually what the customers care about. So if we see organizations from sort of a new perspective, the new lens, it becomes all about value creation and therefore all about meaning. It becomes not about, endless unsustainable growth, but meaningful growth. Long-term mindset, vision and shared goals and shared values. And it's very much people-oriented and almost has this organic view and cyclical kind of thinking, and it's very much based on creativity and creative problem solving. So these two are almost like two different worlds. And the result of these three sort of erosive factors on all of these levels is that obviously what we're dealing with now in business and in brands is a massive meaning and value disconnect between, on one hand, how the brands are managed and how organizations are managed and how they see value. And on the other hand, how culture works, how people work, what people value, and where there is this gap of where your relevance should be on some kind of like a point of identification where the obviously value is created and value is perceived. What is there now is like a disconnect. And the divide between brands and culture is sort of deepening year by year as obviously the culture and the people and the society are evolving much, much faster than the organizations can sort of catch up with. So what we need to bridge this gap is obviously much more than, consumer research that is very much sort of based on validating beliefs and with the past data. What we need is to sort of understand things in a way that we can anticipate and sort of leap towards the future. So what we need is new thinking that will help us obviously make these connections, bridge this gap, and create new value. And this is what I do. This is exactly the reason why I built Meaning Global, to sort of help brands and organizations bridge this value gap between, brands and people. But also what I understand is it will almost require like a quantum leap in our thinking in a way that we understand the world and sort of look at it, because what we need to do obviously to create much more meaning and lead with meaning in business and in branding is that we need to start viewing brands and businesses as dynamic ecosystems of cultural meaning that they truly are. They need to sort of be a mirror. So there is obviously the internal world. This is all about brand values, equity, how the brand sort of sees itself, how your organization sees itself, and then there's the external world, of people, of culture, what we value, and obviously those two need to be mirrored. Otherwise, there's going to be this gap. And why is this important? As I said at the beginning, because brands are in the business of meaning exchange. What people value aren't brands per se, they value meaning. What brands and products mean to them in relation to their own values, beliefs, mindsets, lifestyles, ideals, or wishes, or even fears. What brands mean not on their own, but precisely in relation to our own identity and our own sense of self. It's like a mating game almost. Just gonna skip these real quick. Okay, so now I would like to talk to you more about the gaps of meaning, right? So this is what is the gap of meaning? The gap of meaning is almost like a symbolic disconnect or like a symbolic trap that especially global brands, because they have this universal view on planning, sort of fall into, and it makes the brand sort of look good on the surface as if it's really incorporating these culturally progressive values, but when you really look deep underneath, it kind of doesn't add up. It kind of doesn't really make sense in the real sense of the world. And obviously there are mental disconnects that usually occur between meaning intended on one hand and then meaning that is actually being conveyed. So, and those two, when they are not in accordance, then there is this gap. So what I'm going to do now is maybe play the little video of Gillette campaign.
Bullying.
The Me Too movement against sexual harassment.
Masculinity.
Is this the best a man can get? Is it? We can't hide from it.
Sexual harassment is taking over.
It's been going on far too long. We can't laugh it off.
Who's the daddy?
What I actually think she's trying to say.
Making the same old excuses.
Boys will be boys.
Boys will be boys. Boys will be boys.
But something finally changed.
Allegations regarding sexual assault and sexual harassment.
But she says he's
And there will be no going back. Because we believe in the best in men.
Men need to hold other men accountable.
Smile, sweetie.
Come on.
To say the right thing. To act the right way.
Bro, not cool. Not cool.
Some already are. In ways big
Yo, men.
and small.
I am strong.
But some is not enough.
It's not how we treat each other, okay? Okay.
Because the boys watching today will be the men of tomorrow.
Right. So the problem with this campaign, obviously, was that it sort of had this beautiful uplifting message of social progress and sort of progressive masculinity, but it portrayed it in kind of a tone-deaf take that was very sort of unfortunate due to this ideological framing. And then I will help you understand more about these 4 gaps that I identified in branding and in strategy, and all of them actually can be can be found in this campaign. So the first one is the gap of culture, and this is where obviously brands and companies say something about themselves and want to sort of portray very culturally almost vogue values, but it doesn't really come across that way in a way that people perceive it. So the gap of culture here was that obviously it sort of portrayed men, especially when you look at this shot of the barbecue, in a way that obviously it's supposed to be socially progressive, but then you are still portraying masculinity and progressive masculinity based on sort of residual or culturally outdated behaviors. In a way that they all sort of look the same and behave the same. So that's not very much, you know, in line with what the socially progressive take on masculinity should look like. So here the key question is what you're portraying and how you're actually portraying it still culturally relevant, or are you just trying to portray values in a way that doesn't really make the mark? The other gap is obviously the gap of context. So what brands intend to communicate versus what they're actually saying in the real world context, and how the real world context sort of offsets or shifts the meaning slightly so that you don't actually come across as what you want to say at all, because because the context sort of distorts the message in a very big way. So this is all about the idea versus the actual creative execution. Cultural strategy really won't save brand. Cultural strategy alone really won't save brands. It must be contextualized with the brand's business. So the task at hand is not really about what masculinity means, you know, in the sort of abstract concept in culture today, but precisely what it means to you as a brand and to your core audience. And if you don't really properly contextualize it, it's not going to mean anything, you know. So and you can actually hurt yourself potentially as a brand. So the key question here is what you're saying and doing still contextually relevant, or is it not? The third one is the gap of trust. What brands and organizations say versus what they do. Do they just talk the talk, or do they actually walk the walk as well? And here I think it's kind of the most sensitive one, because it pertains directly to the business, not just the brand. And it's all about the brand values and the actual corporate behaviors. So if you are a brand who wants to be positioned on this ideal of social progressiveness, then and are advocating, social inclusion, gender equality, and a new inclusive world, you really, cannot charge a pink tax on your female products through the mother company. So Gillette, male products are actually much cheaper than the female products. But then how do the brand values actually come into play when the mother company is doing basically the complete opposite of what it wants the brand to look like? So the key question here is, what you're saying relevant and trustworthy, given that you are saying it? And the fourth one is the gap of social impact, which is all about purpose or brand purpose. What role brands aspire to versus what they can actually credibly claim and get away with. And this is all about sort of missing the social mark, right? So you want to be positioned as a brand instead of like a social role. You want to have a social role in the world, but then it can really clash with the way that you are expressing that message. So purpose serves as a great moral compass to guide, brands' own actions, but it really shouldn't allow brands to position themselves in a role of a social watchdog to guide our actions, because brands really don't have the political mandate to tell people what is right and what is wrong and how they should be behaving in society. And it's not their role to police social conduct, which is, I think, the sort of gap or the moment that really hurt Gillette the most here. They were sort of almost policing masculinity. And when you connect it back to their target audience, it's almost like you are treating your very customers and your core target audience as potential, like people who will violate women. I don't want to say the word, like bad people in the making, rather than just saying to them things that are relevant. So here, the key question is, do you have the mandate to be saying what you're saying in the first place? How can we overcome these gaps, right? It's very much about sort of contextual intelligence, emotional intelligence, and cultural intelligence. So the first one, the gap of culture, what really causes it is the inability to navigate this cultural complexity that I was talking about at the beginning in a way that makes sense, right? That actually can encapsulate some kind of real meaning for the brand. So what can bridge it is obviously cultural intelligence and human empathy, to understand how meaning needs to be portrayed and what these cultural trends mean in relation to the customers, in relation to the brand, and have some kind of localized cultural sense. When it comes to the context, obviously here is the inability to foresee how the physical context of a message will shift and offset its intended meaning. And the way we can bridge it is obviously contextual intelligence and planning strategy in the real world, understanding how the real world offsets what we intend to say as a brand. Then you have the integrity or the gap of trust. Here, really, the biggest problem is the inability to deliver on brand promise and company values and do what you say you'll do, leading to almost the state of deception or the lack of corporate integrity. So what bridges it is the integrity of words and actions in accordance with corporate values, really walking the walk, not just talking the talk. And the last one, the gap of social impact, which deals specifically with purpose, is all about sort of misguided idea of brand purpose should be all about, and almost this delusional belief in one's own heroic role in the world as a brand. What it takes to bridge this gap is a radical honesty and humility, instigating a massive action for the good of people and not just brands. And this way we can really bridge the gap of meaning once and for all.
So are you able to summarize for us, Martina?
Sure. I just have a couple of more slides, but I don't really have, much time. Okay, so I'll just, quick summary. So I talked a lot about these sort of disruptive factors in the marketplace, in organizations, in the culture and the world at large. And then I was talking about how this sort of inability to navigate this complexity and cultural sense and meaning and the way that people resonate with brands and emotions, how that looks in terms of strategy and brand campaigns and advertising on this specific Gillette example. Now, why is this idea of leading with meaning really important, and especially why it's gaining importance in business starting this year, starting 2020? I read a very interesting article in Forbes at the end of last year, which is all about we are stepping into this almost like a new meaning paradigm in business, where we are headed towards personal relevance. So it's almost like brands are making or need to be making this 180 degree shift in the way that they view the world. Which is why I was talking about the sort of lens that we use to look at the world.
I provided a link to the interview article that we did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that includes links to your website, which is simply meaning.global. Do you have contact information that you can provide to the attendees?
Sure. Okay, it's at the end. Yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely.
All right, very good. So we'll leave that up for a moment. Thank you for the talk, Martina. I enjoyed the conversation that we had preparing for this. And there's a lot to be said for the semiotics in particular that you touched on.
Mm-hmm.
I love that ideas behind it, as well as the decoding of language and all of the other ways that we convey and consume meaning.